Our next speaker is Mr. Arun Ranjit, CEO and Chief Editor at the Foreign Affairs News, based in Nepal. Mr. Ranjit, would you press the unmute button before starting your presentation? We can't hear you. Oh. Can you try again, please? Can you press the unmute button? We can't hear you. We will get back to you later, after the technical problem is solved. Our next speaker is Mr. Nasir Aijaz, Chief Editor at the Sindh Courier in Pakistan.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. My presentation is a sort of situationer, also containing certain suggestions. I'll start with an old saying that when the well is dry, we know the worth of water. This saying also applies to the alarming situation created by climate change. The world has realized the importance of this issue when it has posed a serious threat. Such a situation has not developed overnight. It is the phenomena that have taken place over the decades. And despite noticing its adverse impacts, most of the nations of the world did not take practical measures to combat this menace at its initial stage. Today, we are faced with extreme weather change and its disastrous impacts. Now the question is what role the media has played to address the climate change. How much has the media covered climate changes? And how do climate change stories come to be reported? It's unfortunate that media has not played its due role. The coverage on climate changes issue is very poor. Instead, the politics dominates the media for rating and financial mileage. If properly surveyed, we will find that less than 1% of the total space and time is given to the environmental issues. There are certain reasons behind such a situation, and those are interests of owners of media houses and the journalists. This is at least situation in Pakistan. Moreover, the journalists have no specialization in coverage of environmental issues. A very few journalists could be found having special interest in coverage of such kind of issues. In most cases, a journalist has to cover many fields at a time because the media houses avoid employing journalists for coverage of different separate fields in order to keep their salary bills at a certain level. Such policies of media houses have affected the overall performance of journalists. This situation prevails in Pakistan, as I already said. Our government, we have government departments and NGOs apparently working on climate issues, but it's just cosmetic service. We have laws, very lot of laws, but you will be surprised to know that my country has become the morgue of such laws, no implementation. So it is a morgue of laws. Now it is direly needed to produce journals in real sense who could understand the gravity of climate change. For this, the journals need to be imparted training in environment sector. The journals also need to understand climate science and climate ethics. They should understand and educate citizens about the ethical dimension of the climate change policy. Finally, I would suggest forming the Global Alliance of Journalists to jointly combat the climate change threats. The proposed alliance should work for getting the journalists trained in coverage of climate issues. They can also share their own experiences from their respective countries. This could be done through the international agencies working on global climate change issues. The proposed alliance may also monitor the media situation, coverage of climate issues in the different countries, and suggest the ways and means for improving it. I also support the ideas and suggestions given by Mr. Jamil from Bangladesh or foreign individuals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Raonidio Pereira, Deputy Editor-in-Chief at the Diário de Noticias in Portugal.
Hello, greetings from Lisbon. I would like to thank the organizers of the World Conference of Journalists for this opportunity to make known a recent experience made by newspaper, Diário Noticias, the oldest daily newspaper in Portugal. Portugal has a deep relationship with the sea. The ocean is part of our history, but it's also part of our future. And even if Portugal is a small country in Western Europe, the geographical localization and in the western point of Iberian Peninsula, plus the two archipelagos that the country has in Atlantic, Azores and Madeira, give it as our country one of the biggest inclusive economic zones worldwide. This is then the sea and the threats against it are thus an issue that the country cannot remain unaware. And even when the COVID-19 pandemic forces us to suspend many activities connected with information of the public opinion or to transform them into online events, as happened with a great conference by the Club of Lisbon about the oceans, the newspaper really want to give attention and provide information to the readers. My newspaper, as one of the media partners of a big conference on oceans, was responsible for attracting the maximum attention of Portuguese readers to the importance of saving the oceans. And to achieve this goal, it was up to me to write an extensive article on the objectives of the conference, interviewing Portuguese and foreign experts that would be speakers at the digital conference. The article was published a week before the first of the 2 days of lectures, both in print and digital edition of Diário Noticias, a newspaper founded in 1864. The idea of the title was to create a surprise among our readers for one of the great evils that affect the oceans, the massive presence of plastics. And now I will quote the Secretary General of the United Nations, the former Portuguese Prime Minister António Guterres. To avoid having more plastic than fish in the sea, oceans have to be debated. Look, this is something that is terrible, thinking in more plastic than fish in the oceans until 2050. Obviously, this kind of sentence has a great impact in a country who have salted cod as the national dish and are among the 3 largest fish consumers per habitant, just behind people of Japan and Iceland. On the eve of the beginning of the conference, Diário Noticias again published a large article alerting the Portuguese to the danger that threats the sea. This time, the editorial option fell on an interview with the special envoy of the United Nations for the oceans, the Fiji diplomat Peter Thompson, that was once his country ambassador to the UN and also president of the General Assembly, and a very important diplomat with this mission of alert people to the danger of the oceans. Again, we decide to use a sentence, in this case from Peter Thomson, to create a kind of shock among our readers. And I will quote, "Either we change our behavior, or in 2040, there will be 50 kilograms of plastic for every meter of coastline around the world." And this was both the title in the front page and in the side pages. The idea was to mobilize the Portuguese public opinion to the protection of the oceans. And it's curious that Peter Thomson rejected the idea of Portugal being a small country with little sense of intervention by its population of only 10 million inhabitants. Then I will quote again. "I would start by saying that I think that people do not look at Portugal as a small country. Your leadership in maritime affairs, your influence around the world throughout the discoveries, make us not think of Portugal as a small country, even with the size of your population. And this could apply to other nations around the world, independent of the size, but with a great relation with the sea." To provide our readers all this information, and we decided in the newspaper that for the sake of the public service, both the articles will be open for readers in general after some hours of exclusive access for our subscribers. We also decided that both articles will be in a prominent position on the home page for many hours, more than is usual for this kind of articles, trying to create more impact. We also sent at least two notifications in 24 hours, and in the same space of time, we published 3 times the same articles on Facebook. The result was a number of page views for each of these 2 articles, well above the average level of readership to articles related to environment, protection of oceans, or climate change. And the lessons we learned, it was that if
Mr.
we
Verrera,
want to have an
please
impact,
wrap it up in 20 seconds.
Okay. The conclusion is that environment must be a priority in the newspapers, even if the level of readership is still not so huge as other subjects like pandemics, COVID-19. But as a newspaper and with our mission of public service, we have to give priority to this kind of articles. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As a reminder, if you have any questions for any of the speakers today, send us your question with the name of the speaker you want to ask that question to. Our next speaker is Mr. Timur Shapiro, Executive Secretary and International Director at the Russian Union of Journalists.
Hello, dear colleagues. Thank you for being here today and for sharing some fruitful ideas with all of us. I would like to talk about a few practical items on work of the journalists covering the global climate issues. To my mind and to mind of many of my colleagues, journalists covering global climate issues have a lot of similarities with scientists in their approach to the daily work. They both do a deep study of materials and cases to seek the truth and share it with the audience. Both of them want to publish their findings first, of course, and before their colleagues, but they also differ. Scientists operate with the facts based on statistics when journalists deal with various single examples. Scientists provide evidences at the beginning of their scientific work and set out the conclusions at the end. Our colleague journalists usually, on the other hand, tend to put their story in the headline of the article. Journalists strive to be the first to present fresh or sensational news. And the news itself is perceived as something that happens unexpectedly, suddenly. But climate changes often lie outside the timeline in which ordinary people live with their everyday worries, and certainly far exceed the frames of TV studios. News have the momentary nature, while changes in the environment are often slow and incremental. Journalists in their daily work have to see through tons of information in order to end up with a concentrated bunch of information in the form of a frame or headline. The headline on climate changes material should reflect the essence of the matter, but its purpose remains the same. It is to get people to continue reading the article, listening to the radio, or watching their TV. Many great journalists, of course, write about the climate changes. Most of these materials are published in science or ecology sections of their newspapers, so online. But it's not necessary for every climate change story to be overloaded with data and statistics. Both scientists and journalists learn to talk about uncertainties in climate science with difficulty and not in the most supportive atmosphere. But this must also be done in order to abandon the black and white picture of the world. Journalists should always, as we think, journalists should always understand the scientific and practical specifics of environmental phenomena, knowledge of historical context of environmental events, and must also be aware of regulatory decisions in the field of environmental policy and activities of environmental organizations, have a general understanding of current environmental problems, and be able to convey all. This information should be provided by journalists to the audience in such a way that it can be deeply understood, despite its complexity. As was said before, journalism covering climate changes differs from other topics, issues, themes of journalism in the way it is presented. This material should not be presented as overly emotional one, in overly emotional form. And this can simply scare, because it can simply scare the readers. On the other hand, a purely informational approach is also not suitable here, as we think, since this case will not be possible to reach out the readers. And environmental journalists need to find this fine line, let's say, when journalistic material evokes a sufficient emotional response, but at the same time does not intimidate the reader. As with any other journalistic materials, professional journalists should check environmental information, use reliable sources, avoid fake or over-sensational news, and comply with the current legislation, of course, in the field of information. It is also important for us, for journalists, to understand that the lack of information on a particular topical issue in the field of ecology leads to an increase in distrust among the audience. Therefore, the provision of the complete and reasoned journalistic information on environmental issues is an important condition for a fake dissemination, for establishing the truth, and for touching the reader and making the reader, the audience, to understand purely 100% the global problem that we all face. Thank you very much, colleagues, for your attention.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Ivan Lim, a chairman at the Environment Communication of Singapore.
Hello. While the world's attention has been focused currently on the leadership summit coming up in the United States on April 22nd, that's Earth Day, an issue closer home has surfaced, and that is the news that Japan is considering on dumping the Fukushima nuclear waste into the Pacific Ocean. Now, my Indonesian colleague, Edi Suprato, sent me this note today saying that if Japan should dump its waste into the Pacific Ocean, then the countries that will be affected before China and South Korea will be Southeast Asian states, and the fisheries that we will harvest from the sea will be contaminated. Now, Eddie has raised a very important issue that has to do with what we call the Nimby Syndrome. Never on my backyard, or never in my backyard. Countries can consider dumping their waste in other countries and even pay for it as long as it doesn't affect their interest or their population. But when it comes to environmental issues, this is a key problem. Sometimes we try to correct our own behavior on the issue of not dumping plastics into our neighborhood or into the ocean. Most of our concern is about ourselves. That as long as it's not in our own backyard, then things can go ahead. And herein lies the problem facing us in handling this climate crisis. Now, when we are talking about taking action on the environment, as journalists, we place several roles: to amplify, to simplify, to analyze. But more important than that is for us also to act on some key important issues. And now I want to share with you that in the Asia-Pacific region, journalist groups from India to Asia, China have been able to come together and network and form the Asia-Pacific Forum of Environmental Journalists. Now this is a grouping that is made up of National Forum of Environmental Journalists in different countries: Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, China, Pakistan. And through such networking, we're able to conduct training programs, hold seminars, and share ideas on environmental issues confronting our region. And what is being done is also to help us understand better the issues confronting our region. And I think from our discussion, we know that this is more needed than ever before. But over time, the FH, Asia Forum Environmental Journalists, has fallen on funding problems and also on leadership issues. And as a result, there's much work to be done. What I would like to suggest at this conference that we as Asian journalists and also with our friends from the Western countries come together to strengthen such a network of environmental journalists and do our part to share information. I think we have tried, the FH, Asia Forum, to set up what we call a handbook for environmental information, ideas, and definitions to help journalists simplify issues and explain key complex issues in their writing. But what is needed now is for us to turn it into a digital handbook where you can access online and share information and ideas. I think this is what I propose that we, in the Asia Journalists Federation, AJA, Journalists Association of Korea, come together and do something about this. Another important thing we need to do is now to reach out to the young generation. I think Greta Thunberg of Sweden, she has highlighted the need for future generations to do their part, to be concerned about how the climate crisis will affect their future. And what we need to do is to reach out to our own young generation through our national network of environmental journalists and get them to be involved in this setup. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Aour Kadar Ismail, Information Secretary and Human Rights Officer at the National Union of Somali Journalists.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm glad to attend this important forum, and I would like to appreciate Journalists Association of Korea and its leadership for organizing this fruitful meeting of conference. Please next. Climate change is mostly as a result of environmental destruction, which is a global tragedy, it is today more dangerous than ever to vulnerable countries. Journalism can contribute by making people aware of subsequent effect of climate change at all levels. The media as a source of information might play a significant role in raising public awareness and understanding of climate sciences. Please next. As many vulnerable people have no techniques or methods that they can undertake to control climate change, journalism can guide in many pathways to adapt climate change to derive the adverse of effects bring with it. Next, please. A quick urbanization and lack of pasture for livestock are visible signs of today's climate change in many countries and that represent twin global challenges, particularly in sub-Saharan countries, especially Somalia. As such, the awareness and civic education on these issues will achieve the following objectives. Next, please. Increase public understanding of what climate change is, its impact, and the risks on social economy. So the public will take their self-determination and think of resilience. Translate and summarize complications of climate change policies and initiatives so it is understandable and accessible to broader audiences. The more increased awareness is the more increased public demand for government accountability for domestic actions on climate change policies. Next, please. Also, the vital role of media in climate change will contribute to the public, local authorities, and governments to understanding of the current situation of climate change in the country and the process of create awareness campaigns in an information exchange mechanism where the public, authorities, stakeholders, and policymakers understand and adapt to impacts of climate change and increase society's resilience. At the same time, journalism should also educate people on afforestation and how to avoid deforestation. The changes mostly affect vulnerable households, especially women, children, and aged ones, since they can't afford to get water from long distances. These changes also can affect pastoralists, farmers, and fishery. All these things are what all in many countries, especially sub-Saharan, including sub-Saharan countries, including Somalia, have already practiced. And as a media, we have to organize and to put our attention and focus all these issues. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Sebastian Auyanet, publisher and strategic consultant at the Now This News in Uruguay.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Can you see me? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
So, okay, so basically, like the title of my presentation is a question, which is, you really think will fix this winter article? So back in 2017, I had the amazing chance to be a part of the first cohort of a Resilience Journalism Fellowship at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, now renamed Craig Newmark's Graduate School of Journalism in New York City. So gathered in New York City with more than 10 of the best climate journalists in the United States, Africa, and Europe, I learned how to learn the ropes about reporting on resilience issues. So basically, resilience is the ability for a system to go back to its normal functioning after a huge impact. The concept can be big or small. And while in New York, we visited huge facilities we tool to sustain floods, a project to contain the tidal wave in New York City, and also a local community farm at the Bronx. In New York City, I spent a year covering how big of a problem was the lack of access to air conditioning units in poor areas of New York City, like public housing. So this is a stealth problem that wasn't even detected by the people who were going to suffer it the most some years after, when I worked with scientists that were extremely concerned about the potential effects of this. So to put it simply, concrete buildings in poorly ventilated areas might become heat islands, which are places that keep extreme heat during the day and during the night in the summer. In some demographics, like children, it can produce asthma as a chronic condition. In the eldest people, it can cause dehydration. So neither New York City or the state of New York were able to give any solutions to these problems for these people. In New York City, to get an AC unit, in a public housing unit, you need permits and to pay an extra fee. Something that people who live in those places just can't get easily. And it was only now, after a huge impact that COVID-19 had in several poor areas of the city, that New York City decided to address the solution. Back in the day, I partnered with local organizations and scientists to find avenues to get to the front doors of these citizens with postcards that had information that they could use to improve their situation, facing a summer that was going to be loaded with heat waves. And basically, I think that the role of journalism should increasingly be about not only being able to alert when a system is less resilient, but also to provide more active ways to engage with the communities that they want to serve. So probably articles are not going to make it. Probably something that you publish in traditional media is not going to make the trick work. But basically, what I sense that we have to be more proactive in filling the spaces that are not filled with information and repackage articles in science, maybe in memes, maybe in the format of those long texts that uncles, aunts, and grandpas send through WhatsApp. Like, do whatever it takes to confront the people with a key piece of information that can benefit the community that you aim to serve. And mine was basically an isolated effort, the byproduct of a focused initiative as a part of an educational program aimed to develop new techniques and routines. But there are new developments, such as the study of climate-related issues in Latin America from organizations like El Sur in Paraguay, and InfoBay's recent coverage of illegal fishing efforts from foreign ships close to Argentina's regional sovereign waters. I sense that given the amount of organizations that I work with currently in Latin America, content distribution efforts are still an area that has to be more strategic, with a strong degree of analytics, observation, and lots of flexibility. And where I work at Now This News, in charge of the Spanish channels, flexibility is what defines the content and distribution strategy. Distribution is only the tip of the iceberg, and I feel like journalism should also reiterate and adopt a constantly flexible mentality regarding not only content and how it is sent to readers, but also their business model overall. And to end my presentation, there are only 3 things I think journalism should be more proactive in order to play a significant role in the current global climate crisis. First, it's to take an activist approach. But while any piece of journalism should be transparent about its author's political and civic views, there is still a perception that the journalist should not be in favor of any causes. And I feel that the urgent crisis and its consequences will force journalists to side with the people who suffer more. Second is to make your journalism more memberful. As a consultant for membership programs in countries such as Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Argentina, I can say that membership is not only a financial transaction between a loyal reader and a news organization, but also a contract that involves more participation from your readers. And that implies working on healthier relationships with your audiences. And third, and to close, make alliances. How you can reach the people that you want to reach and get resources you might need for that. The answer might not be in your own city or country, but global climate issues are something that affects us in every country. Just as that other journalists like here and newsrooms around the world are ready to band together for a common effort. To close, we like to say that journalism is a public service, yet we usually force our readers to go into our channels and to adapt to our own formats in order to get the information they need. And I think that it needs to change. And in order to tackle the challenges that the global climate change will bring, we need to understand that in order to provide a service, we need to improve our ability to form relationships and to prioritize process over product and always to do what we do. Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. Tiran Chu, editor at the Dantri online newspaper in Vietnam.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, moderator. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Many of us had a difficult year last year, struggling to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. But in Vietnam, we had to suffer another disaster besides coronavirus. Terrible typhoon, flooding, and landslide left more than 200 people dead, and at least 5.5 million people in the central region of Vietnam were badly affected. Next page, please. Here you can see some photos of the Vietnamese people during the historic flooding last October. Next page, please. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah. At the World Journalist Conference last year, I talked about the key roles of Vietnamese journalists in the fight against coronavirus. But in that year, local journalists were also praised for their great efforts in dealing with the flooding disasters. Indeed, the media in Vietnam has been acknowledged as one of the leading forces in the fight against climate change, which has caused more serious natural disaster in the country recently. Our journalists, however, are facing lots of challenges and need both effort and support to better perform their work. Firstly, I think that journalists need to understand and share with the victims of climate change. During the flooding in Vietnam last October, some local journalists received a lot of compliments, not only for their bravery to head to the flooded site, but also for their deep understanding and sharing with the local people. I would like to share some more photos of local reporters working on the issue. Next page, please. In this photo, a reporter of the Vietnam News Agency collapsed to his knee when seeing rescue forces recovering the body of a 2-year-old baby who was buried in a landslide in Quảng Nam province. The scenes were recorded by other reporters and made headlines in many newspapers. And it really showed the great pain caused by natural disasters. Next page, please. And here is an MC of the Vietnam television. He cried during a live program that showed the great losses of the flood victim. These journalists then said sorry for not having been able to control the feeling and somehow affected their programs, but they received lots of good feedback from the public for their sympathy and with the flood victims, and their programs proved to be more successful. Secondly, I think that journalists need to seek support from the government and various organizations to fight against climate change. The destruction of forests have been pointed out by environment experts as the main causes of natural disasters in Vietnam. Statistics from local authorities show that the country is losing over 2,000 hectares of forest every year. And meanwhile, many forest destruction cases have been uncovered by the reporters before local authorities take action to deal with the problems. In many cases, local officers were found to support and cooperate with loggers to destroy the forest. And illegal loggers have also become more violent. And that means journalists are facing dangers and need to seek cooperation and support from different forces to do their work. And last but not least, I think that journalists need to keep on learning. Knowledge is always an important factor that we journalists should take all chances to improve. Laws are constantly amended and climate change issues are becoming more complicated. And the illegal forest loggers are having more tricks. So that's why we journalists should try to keep up with the new laws and reality to have good articles. Climate change is becoming a global burning issue, but with our efforts, sympathy and understanding and good knowledge, we journalists can play an important role in fighting it. That's my presentation. Thank you for listening. Goodbye and stay safe.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. Our next speaker is Ms. Nguyen Toho Ami, reporter at the Vietnam Journalist Association.
My sincere greeting to all of you. I am honored for the second time representing Vietnam Journalist Association to attend the World Journalist Conference. In 2020, at this conference, I am share the situations of Vietnam media and the success of Vietnam over the pandemic. Like the sharings of my colleague, Ms. Lan, currently Vietnam has successfully controlled the third wave of COVID-19. However, in the parallel with the pandemic, we have been facing the serious effects of climate change. Next slide, please. In complicated development of drought, floods, landslide, and storm causing serious effects to the economy, which more depends on agriculture. In particular, due to the long coastline, Vietnam is considered as one of the most countries being affected by climate change. In Vietnam, it is difficult not to be tempted to compare COVID-19 crisis with the recent series of tropical storms that ravaged the country's central regions. The pandemic has killed so far 35 people, while the storm caused over 250 casualties and affected directly about 1.5 million people during a few weeks in October and early November 2020. More than 100 reported deaths or missing after two storms destroyed homes and leave trails for destruction. Next, please. The economic losses associated with the pandemic containment measure have been substantial in 2020, leading to a projected 4.2% drop in GDP growth compared to the economy trajectories COVID-19. Meanwhile, the economic damage from the storm have been estimated in the range of $1.3 billion or approximately 0.5% of GDP. The burden of climate change will be mainly on future generations, but the costs of inaction are already visible today. Beyond the damage associated with the bigger and more frequent storms, the high level of air pollution in Vietnam major cities are already causing death of around 60,000 people per year, according to the World Health Organization. The Mekong Delta is an ecological disaster because of rising ocean water and exhaustion of cultivable land, leading to productivity loss in agriculture. I could easily multiply those examples, but in my main message is that the current loss associated with environmental damage and climate change can reach, when taken together, as much as 6 to 7 percentage point of GDP in Vietnam. Next, please. The last editions of Vietnam's taking stock reported by the World Bank argue that the successful management of COVID-19 crisis can inspire Vietnam to tackle better environmental and climate change. In the light of ongoing climate crisis and the rise of climate struggles all over the globe, the contribution of journalists to informing public discourse should not be overlooked. Climate journalism fulfills a unique role in the cover one of, or if not the most pressing issues in our time. It includes coverage of the latest environmental predictions and scientific data, as well as reporting for climate summit and convention, thereby contributing to the public debate on climate crisis. Thus, climate journalists serving as public watchdog join forces with environmental on raising awareness, advocating for solutions, and find a way to overcome the climate crisis. Next, please. To imperative to fight the growth climate crisis with multi-angle approach, the climate journalism is particularly important in environmental policy making. Climate journalists do well in their roles not only to inform the public, but also to evoke effective environmental protection policy. Through the climate journalism, policymakers grab not hard issue and they are concerned to the public, college people opinion to adjust policy. In the world, In the world in journalism and in Vietnam in particular, the number of journalists working on climate change prevent is growing strongly. They have reached a global network to support and help each other to improve the efficiencies of reporting and propaganda. In 1909, more than 1,000 televisions around the world entered the Paris Declaration on broadcasting and combat climate changes by pledging the promote reporting on the public and pay more attention to the voice of affected groups. In recently, thanks to media, climate change has become the top concerns of Europeans, overcoming the subject of terrorism. According to the surveys in 2019 of European Parliament, the climate change has become the focus and set for the state for more effective policy to combat global warming and encourage business to take responsibility on environmental consequences. Next, please. An awareness society is the best weapon against climate change, and it is when the climate journalists play a crucial role. They inform and they raise awareness among people. Sadly, people and climate journalism sometimes place much more value and occasions catastrophic events than phenomenon that they are slowly and they are most imperceptible. Story and report on environment prepared by institutions are the great resources of information. However, the problem is that the media are limited in their resource of information about climate change. Therefore, I think the media desk is in need of cooperation with climate authority or experts. It is also necessary to build up a multidimensional relationship and establish climate change communication network between journalists and the mentioned factor to access information and give the right direction on related issue. Every day, our association sets up so many technical training where the journalists can share the views or they can have more information resources about environmental. When we also invite experts to update climate change data on affecting each locality so that the journalists can leave a message or orient the citizen to improve response measure. Next, please. In this responsibility of climate change, climate journalists to know that climate journalism is the right platform for journalism. The climate crisis affects the most vulnerable first as well as the hardest. Therefore, good and responsible storytelling is the key to presenting the topic in the way of making the public both awareness and empowered to act. Thank you for your attention, and I am so appreciative for all the effort of Journalist Association of Korea overcoming the difficulties of COVID-19 pandemic to hold this teleconference, a land for our journalists to meet and sharing information. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now we are going to get back to Mr. Lanjit, CEO and Chief Editor at the Foreign Affairs News in Nepal.
Okay, hello. Can
Hello.
you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
First of all, I beg excuse for facing the technical problem in my computer because of net loss. So I'm joining from my handphone. Okay, I'll start. Namaste, annyeonghaseyo. Hello, good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, dear journalist friends attending WJC 2021 online from the globe. Here is my thoughts on global climate issues. Climate change is the biggest challenge facing humanity, not only because of the urgent threats it poses, but also its scale and complexity, as environmental change increasingly becomes a universal matter of concern caused by various human activities that produce greenhouse gases that contribute to an increase in average temperatures on all continents and to global changes in climatic conditions. It impacts naturally and socially that affect societies around the world. Yes, climate change hazards can have substantial negative effects on every aspect of society, from food and water security to migration, employment, and economic stability. It poses risks to long-term sustainability, hits human lives, change in weather patterns, and sea level rising. The Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015, aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by keeping a global temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. It also aims to strengthen the ability of countries to deal with the impacts of climate change. Pollution, climate change, habitat loss, and overexploitation are putting millions of human beings at risk. The United Nations report of January 2021 says extreme weather pushed more than 34 million people into harm. The global challenge, it requires a solution globally. To not one or two countries' separate actions are enough, but ultimately needs joint effective strategies by all the major emitting nations. The global effort to manage climate change has been organized through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, launched at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit to achieve GSG concentration. Resulting international process, 194 countries' participation endorsed the aim to achieve net zero emission by 2050. In Himalayan region, Nepal and the entire greater Himalaya region are facing multiple challenges due to climate change. Mountain landscapes, including Himalayan glaciers, are already showing indications of climate change impacts. Snow-capped high mountains play a special role in understanding climate change, which is already affecting ecosystem service. No doubt, climate change can affect people's well-being in a variety of ways. Various countries of the Hindu Kush Himalayan region have prepared greenhouse gas inventories to emit approximately 17% of the total global greenhouse gas emission. Role of journalism. As climate change is a cross-sectional topic that doesn't know the boundary, thus journalism plays an important role in society to uptake climate change issues with intensive coverage that may create a situation for the governments to act. Moreover, media coverage of climate change has had effects on public opinion. No doubt the media, being a watchdog, has an important role that can powerfully translate the impacts of climate change in an understandable and conscionable way to control environmental degradation. Climate change is a crisis, but until recently, the global media has struggled to effectively report on a phenomenon that touches virtually every corner of the world. We can and must do more to bring more innovation to fight against climate change. Let's work together to create the world safe in every aspect, where we want to live and thrive for generations to come. Climate change calamities are global issues. Rich countries are investing heavily in adapting to climate change threat, while pandemic COVID-19 has focused the world's attention on sweeping health, societal, and economic system, demonstrated the interconnectedness of climate effects in humans' livelihoods. Journalists from across the world still face an uphill task of climate-related reporting with challenges. However, climate issues are slowly gaining media attention globally with significance. Tackling the climate crisis therefore demands coordinated global approaches and multi-sectoral solutions to enable effectiveness on the environmental issue. Thank you, Kamsamida.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Malik Slemana, a senior journalist at the Ghanaian Times in Ghana. Due to technical issues, we are going to play his video presentation.
Good afternoon, good evening, colleague journalists across the globe. My name is Malik Sulemana, write for the Ghanaian Times newspaper, one of the leading newspapers in Ghana, being produced by New Times Corporation. I bring you warm greetings from Accra, the capital city of the Republic of Ghana. Kindly permit me to express my profound gratitude. The Journalists Association of Korea selected me as one of the speakers at this year's conference. Many years ago, pandemics and wars were the things that threatened human existence. But the world is no longer at war, since the Second World War ended some 8 decades ago. Today, the world is racing against time to find a cure for the COVID-19 pandemic, which is wreaking havoc across the globe. But there is a bigger war, much bigger than what the human mind can comprehend. It is the climate change. Climate change has been with us for centuries. Governments across the globe are aware of the health and economic dangers that climate change poses to human existence. Climate change is an imminent existential threat, yet little is done to curb its effect. The world is getting warmer. Regardless, the debate about the causes of rising temperatures continue unabated, with every nuance argued hysterically by critics of climate change. The good news is that advancement in scientific research and technology has significantly contributed to the fight against this pandemic and to the role of the media. This is the reason the role of journalists in the fight against climate change cannot be underestimated. The world is at a stage where this fight must be taken a notch higher if communities, human beings, wildlife, vegetation, and aquatic life are to be saved and preserved from total extinction. To address climate change, journalists must use their tools to call for increased government investment in clean energy, provision of potable drinking water, and advocate ban on illegal mining, tree planting, and so on. In Ghana, for example, water bodies are constantly being polluted by the activities of illegal miners. Wells and springs, thus sources of drinking water in some communities, are drying up on daily basis. Deforestation and urbanization are contributing to food shortage. Communities along the coast are displaced by rising while emission of carbon monoxide from dirty vehicles into the environment, erratic rainfall and diseases. Worse still, data from the Ghana Health Service suggests that 3,000 Ghanaians die of borne diseases caused by inhaling toxic chemicals from the air. This figure is more than deaths caused by malaria, tuberculosis, cholera, and AIDS. In many countries, the adverse impact of climate is driving people out of jobs that lead to global unemployment. This exposing government must make an effort to get the climate change. In Ghana, I am leading a campaign in basic schools and communities to sensitize pupils and members of the public alike about clean cooking methods such as the use of gas instead of firewood. My advocacy as a journalist and climate change activist has benefited more than 500 school children in the greater Accra region. On this occasion, I call on journalists across the globe to make an impact towards the fight against climate change. Thank you for the opportunity to act is now much and to the special opportunity to speak on global climate issues and the role of journalism. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least, we have Ms. Yoonjiro, environmental reporter at the 세계일보, a daily newspaper in Korea.
Hello. Finally, I'm the last speaker. Thank you for staying connected. Well, I'm afraid none of us here is from Saudi Arabia, Australia, or New Zealand, but in 2016, the Climate Action Tracker, an independent scientific group, coined the term climate villain and put Korea, along with those 3 countries I mentioned, into that category. Since then, not only foreign media, but also Koreans have self-mockingly called Korea climate villain. In 2009, Korea voluntarily has pledged to cut carbon emissions by 30% against BAU emissions in 2020. But in short, the goal wasn't achieved. In 2015, the Korean government announced a mitigation target 37% below BAU by 2030 and received criticism from abroad on backsliding in the original self-imposed 2020 mitigation plan. For these reasons, Korea became the climate villain. But it is not just the government to blame. In the summer of 2019, I wrote a short series of articles about why Korea is so indifferent to climate change. At the time, I remember an environmental activist saying, like, I know we should campaign for climate change, but fine dust is more of an issue, so blah, blah, blah. The same goes for citizens. More than 90% of people agree that climate change is a serious problem. But when asked about short-term priorities, climate change only ranked 7th after economic growth, unemployment, etc. It was ranked 3rd for the midterm and then 2nd for the long-term priority. The press, too, is much different. As you may know, it was Songdo, Incheon, where the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius was released. Despite the importance of the report and despite the fact that it was published here in Korea, the amount of media coverage was dismal. However, things have completely changed last year. There were 2 iconic turning points. One was the president's announcement of the Green New Deal in May, and the other was commitment to net zero in November. Originally, the Korean New Deal was designed as a digital New Deal. Later on, however, President Moon Jae-in stated the Green New Deal as an axis of the Korean New Deal along with the Digital New Deal in May. And 2 months later, the comprehensive plan was announced. Then, last November, President Moon surprised many by declaring 2050 net zero target. It was particularly surprising because the government had kept silent for a long time, suddenly announced the declaration. I believe the Korean attitude toward climate change can be divided into before and after last November. Eventually, we began to realize that climate change is an inevitable issue. Since the declaration of net zero, companies have been vigorously proclaiming ESG management, and more financial companies have been participating in climate finance. Environment used to be thought as a matter of regulation and cost, and is now regarded as a way of finding new growth strategies. The slogans to decarbonize Korea can be heard everywhere now. It's time for the media to distinguish the real from the fake among the numerous promises made by governments and corporations in order not to be fooled by greenwashing. Unfortunately, Korean media is busy delivering those slogans. Claims are delivered without media scrutiny. For example, there are many companies that promise to reduce carbon emissions, but in fact, it is ambiguous to what extent the reduction will be done. What tools and methods are needed? There are some questions that remain. The same is true for the promises of the government and the politicians. The coherence between climate and energy policy, not to mention agriculture, forestry, fisheries, etc., still leaves a question mark. In Korea, the by-election was held about 2 weeks ago, and during the campaign, the pledges on climate change increased significantly in quantity, but many of them were below expectations in terms of quality. Reporters should point out the problems, but it is not as easy as it sounds. In my opinion, Korea's unique or closed coverage culture makes it difficult. There is an invisible partition. Society reporters are reluctant to deal with politics or corporate issues, and reporters for the Ministry of Environment are not supposed to write articles on the matters of the Ministry of Industry. Even for a reporter who is free from this issue, the problem still remains. How can I easily deliver the stories to the readers? As a reporter for a newspaper, it is an important question. Writing articles that are both professional and readable is as difficult as having your cake and eating it. I'm still looking for the answers. And it is time to raise the qualitative level of climate change news that has exploded in quantity. I hope to find the answers through the discussions here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your valuable opinions and insights. Now, let's get right into the Q&A session. We have 2 questions, and first one is for Mr. Chang Daul. Here's the question. Do you believe the coronavirus pandemic has brought some positive changes in terms of reducing greenhouse gases? Your response?
Hello. Well, first of all, thank you for all the presentations from respected journalists from all over the world. And I hope everybody still maintains your concentration after almost 2 hours session. I met hardly people who can keep their concentration more than 2 hours, but let's see. We can try our best. And thank you for the question. Yes, a lot of people are saying that because of COVID-19, which makes our life so difficult, but there are positive impact from COVID-19, such as less air pollution because of less industrial activities, less transport, less manufacturing, and because of that we have a better, cleaner sky, cleaner river, cleaner forest. Yes, that's actually true. Even though we didn't want it to have this better sky with COVID-19, our sky became cleaner and our river became cleaner. But when it comes to the climate change, the COVID-19 didn't make our climate crisis better. In fact, the global total carbon emissions from energy-related activities in 2020 reduced by 6%, precisely 5.8% compared to 2019. But that's the decrease of annual carbon emission in 2020 compared to 2019. But in absolute terms, the carbon concentration in the atmosphere in 2020 increased compared to 2019. So climate never become better. As our respected colleague Angel Fernando Galindo Ortega correctly pointed out during his speech today, that we should not take an apocalyptic approach. We should not exaggerate some extreme ideas. I absolutely agree with what Ortega said. But it is true that today is always better than tomorrow in terms of the climate crisis. Even if we stop our carbon emission to 0 from today, become carbon neutral, still the global warming will continue for at least 20 or 30 years. So because of the annual emission in 2020 reduced from 2019 level, it doesn't mean that climate get better. It gets worse and worse every year until we reach to carbon neutral stage. And also, when we talk about the economic recovery from the COVID-19 outbreak, people are saying we should go back to the past. We should go back to the normal. But as we all know that the normal was already a crisis, we should not go back to the normal. We build back better. We build back better economic system, not mainly based on fossil fuels, but based on renewable energies. We should build back better our transport system, not based on gasoline and diesel cars, but based on public transport, bicycles, railways, and electric vehicles, hydrogen electric vehicles. And we should not produce a lot of goods and services which increase the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. So when a lot of countries are talking about recovery from COVID-19, we should go for better recovery. We should go for green recovery. Otherwise, the situation will get worse and worse.
Thank you very much. Our next question is for Mr. Habib Tomi. Here's the question. Can you tell us about the method and initiative that the Bahrain News Agency has taken to improve the quality of the articles on climate change issues.
Thank you. First, a side point. When in my presentation, I talked about not underestimating the role of the media. Suddenly, I discovered that many people are overestimating the role of the media, and it's more or less blaming the media for what's happening. There's a lot of pressure on the media that journalists should do, journalists must do. Correct, that's true. But it's not only journalists who must do, it's also the government, policymakers, businesses, scientists who don't want to compromise, always using their own language, etc. So let's be fair. It's not the journalists, it's everybody. It's not the planet of the journalists, it's the planet of everybody. That's the first point. Second point, regarding the media coverage of climate change in Bahrain. Well, like in most countries, it lies somewhere between reality and expectations. At Bahrain News Agency, for example, we deal with two sides, the official and the private. At the official level in Bahrain, we have the Supreme Council for the Environment, with which the agency works closely to learn more about policies, issues, locally, regionally, and internationally. In fact, the Bahrain News Agency has assigned a reporter to the council. That's his beat. He covers only the council. At the private level, Bahrain News Agency and other media in Bahrain are plugged into pro-environment NGOs and other groups that are engaged in awareness campaigns and activities that can vary a lot, starting from cleaning up beaches to other activities to protect the environment. Bahrain also has a good program with the Bahrain Journalists Association to help train journalists on covering climate change issues. That's one of the hardest beats for any journalist, unless you're really qualified in science and you can challenge scientists and you can challenge people. You cannot claim that you are a good science journalist. And then also Bahrain steadily, Bahrain News Agency steadily carries articles about major issues, whether they are in Bahrain, in the Middle East, or internationally. We try not to take sides, of course, because we know there are many layers, political, economic, and social layers, but we do cover what's happening in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much.